You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. Hello, and thank you for returning to join me on Mysteries and Monsters. On this episode, we turn our attention to some unusual encounters occurring on the highways and byways of England in the company of Dr Rob Gandy. Rob joined me way back on episode 48 to discuss some haunted highways, but it seems one particular area of Lincolnshire is home to something rather disturbing. Now known as the Ruskington Horror, a term coined in 1999 by ITV's Richard Madeley. Something is causing motorists and their passengers to be terrified out of their wits. Is it something supernatural? Simply a question of pure coincidence? Could it even be the brain's response to the area's flat geography? Or, as some claim, a shade of some poor departed soul who finds themselves trapped on this lonely road? We discuss some of the witnesses and cases to have experienced the Ruskington Horror, as well as touching on some other hauntings across the country, some strange stories of a local goblin, and a couple of sporting curses as well. A big thank you as always to Rob for returning to the show. As always, you can find us across all social media platforms. We've pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you can subscribe to our channel on YouTube. You can also support Mystery and Monsters via Patreon for $4 a month for early releases of all the episodes, bonus content, and prize draws. As always, artwork for the show is by Dean Bestall. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is proud to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. So, just what is going on in Lincolnshire? And can Dr Rob Gandy help us get to the bottom of the Ruskington Horror? Today on Mysteries and Monsters, it's a warm welcome back to Dr Rob Gandy. Rob appeared back on episode 48 where we discussed phantom hitchhikers and road ghosts, and it seems that certain areas of the UK create an environment that allows strange things to occur to travellers. However, one particular case has risen to prominence and is known as the Ruskington Horror, currently appearing in a series of articles by Rob in the Fortean Times. Rob, welcome back, sir.
Thank you very much. Good to be on the programme again.
Yes. Been too long, my friend.
It's a year, yeah.
Yes. As we were discussing last year, this is a wonderful phenomenon, and you have managed to track down some fabulous stories over the years from around the UK and further afield. Yeah. And as I touched on in the introduction, this particular one, the Ruskington Horror, seems to have really kind of elevated itself to become probably the most well-known out of them over the last few years.
Yeah, yes, it has. I mean, but it had gone a bit quiet on it, if I can say that. I suppose that writing articles in Fortean Times about it will give it a lot more prominence. If you think back, the programme on ITV this morning with Richard Madeley, where it all kicked off, was way back in 1998. So I, at the end of my article in Fortean Times many moons ago about the Old Man of Halsall Moss, which is a very flat area in West Lancashire, I'd asked the question, rhetorically maybe, about whether it was something in the landscape that might create these sorts of phenomena. Because with it being very flat, you get mists, your perspective can be a bit distorted at times, particularly at night. Anyway, I said, I wonder if there would be anything like this in like the fens of East Anglia or the Somerset Levels and places like that. And I can't remember exactly how, but I was possibly lazily Googling away, as you do sometimes, and I came across the Ruskington Horror. And, of course, it struck me, being familiar with Lincolnshire, because I used to live in Leicestershire for several years, and therefore travelled to Lincolnshire on quite a few occasions. It's as flat as a pancake in a lot of parts of it. And so I thought I need to look into this a lot further. And, of course, there were quite a few websites which quoted some of the text, some of the commentary from the programme, not all of it. And so it was in late 2017 that I got in touch with the people to do with ITV this morning and actually acquired a DVD of all the episodes that had taken place back in 1998. And what you have to remember is that the way that programs like This Morning work is that there's lots of different things going on the program, and so you'll get an advert, and then they'll say, and next we'll go over to such and such, and then they'll go to something completely different. So it's about people watching the TV in the day and trying to sober up from the night before in many cases. Well, in my case it is. So what had happened was that Richard Madeley, Judy Finnegan wasn't with him on that day. They were looking at, it was an open house type section of their programme where they invited people to ring in, and the part of the programme concerned was called Living with Ghosts, and so you had people ringing in from all over the shop, all over the country. But then this one person rang in called Kevin Whelan, who'd been driving down the A15 towards Sleaford, his home, and this was only a couple of weeks before the actual programme was broadcast, so it was very, very recent and very, relevant to the programme. And he described how he'd been, driving down the main road, probably at about 60 miles an hour or something like that, when it was a Sunday morning, 2 a.m., and he's on the horizon near the Ruskington turnoff. He saw something floating that looked a little like a white bin bag, he thought, and so he wasn't concerned, he picked up in the car headlights or maybe something similar. But when he got to where it was, a face suddenly appeared around the car's front pillar at the top right of the windscreen, and it was Greek-looking with dark hair and an olive green skin, and was holding his left hand up. And he said it had got a pitted face, and he could see its teeth. And below the neck was a kind of white fluorescence, like where you've got a photographic image when a camera flashes too bright. Needless to say, Kevin was shocked and scared. And he carried on driving. He estimated for probably about 40 or 50 seconds, which is something that I'll come back to in a minute, before whatever it was slid off down the side of the car, at which point he then bombed it back home, ran into the house and woke his wife up. And apparently when he looked in the mirror, his face was white and his skin was covered with goosebumps, and his wife confirmed that he was panicking and crying, and he told about what had happened. In all their time together, she'd never seen him quite so distressed. And naturally, people like Reverend Lionel Fanthorpe from Fortune TV on that session and that. And the balloon went up. Richard Madeley thought this was brilliant, and obviously then thought we'll have to get a team of people out there, and pursue it, and chase down what's going on. And it was Richard himself who coined what he openly admits is a bit of a penny dreadful touch, of calling it the Ruskington Horror. So, yeah.
Yeah.
That's how it all kicked off.
Absolutely. I mean, it does seem that it really caught people's imagination, because on This Morning it's a very varied programme. There's all kinds of stuff going on, as you say, and sometimes it's hard to keep up, Rob, with all kinds of sections about all kinds of things. So what I was always impressed about when this kicked off was that this morning, rather than just leaving it and going, oh, well, we might come back to that later in the year, they really embraced it, whether that was down to Richard Madeley's fascination with this or, he really sort of took to this. Because over the next sort of couple of weeks, they basically decided to try and do a full investigation of the area as often as they could.
Absolutely. I mean, they sent the team out. The first thing that they did was that they got a team with Nina Miskow, or is it Miskow? I'm never too sure. At the Duke of Wellington pub in Leasingham, which is about 3 miles from Ruskington. You have to bear in mind that Ruskington itself is actually a mile or so from that part of the A15 where these things have been happening. It's a village off to the eastern side of the road, of the strip, which then, and the A15 then goes down to Leasingham. And they got people in from all over, and they got Kevin Whelan and Sarah Martin, who's also been in touch about her experiences, and they refer to some of the other local ghost stories about a woman in a pink ball gown and 2 white cart horses being seen on 3 occasions on the same stretch of road. And she interviewed Kevin and his wife and corroborated the story. I mean, Sarah Martin's story was. Look, she and her partner had been to the cinema in Lincoln and were heading down the A15 towards Cranwell, which was in about 1997. So this would be 1 or 2 years before Kevin's experience. And on the corner near the Braunswell and Leadenham turn-off, a black silhouette of a man ran out from the ditch and went straight in front of the car. Logically, they should have hit it, but there was no impact and seemingly nothing was there. The figure had no face, and Sarah cried out. But actually, her partner, who was driving, didn't see anything, which, as you will know, is sometimes one of the things that happens. Some people, where you've got multiple witnesses, sometimes one sees something and the other one doesn't. Yeah. But sometimes you get 2 or 3 people all seeing the same thing. You have to keep an open mind about things. But she said that what it was horrid and really frightening. So this is what you might call the classic phantom jaywalker, where somebody runs out, apparently goes under the car. I mean, she didn't say that they stopped, but often the person will then stop and have a look around under the car, behind the car, all round, and there's nothing to be found. But that's that's a typical case that she had, and 1 or 2 of the other witnesses for the Ruskington Horror told similar stories about somebody or something running out in front of the car and then thinking that they'd hit it. As I say, we went back to Richard's team went and interviewed people at the Duke of Wellington. So this morning sent out a team. And there were a young man and woman who were the main typical journalists who were involved. But they also included a lady called Shirley Wallace, who was a psychic investigator, medium, and a fellow who was a dowser. And what was interesting was that they focused on the tower of Temple Brewer's Preceptory, which was once attached to a 13th century Knights Templar church, which I think was supposed to be the second biggest Templar establishment outside of London back in the times when the Templars were on the go. Now, Richard Madeley described it, and they described it as being right next to this epicentre of all the activity, but actually it's a couple of miles away. But with journalists, I'm always, I think it was a bit of a gift. You can't very well go researching the area and find that it's got something to do with the Knights Templar and somehow, involve it. Yes. And it was interesting in that they went in there and they were talking about it being where ley lines cross and how there were cold places and so on and so forth. And Shirley was saying about how the beams in the wooden cross in the ceiling were said to align with the ley lines. And Shirley said that she'd been seen in advance that the tower had a night hospitaller as its guardian, and stated that there was a vortex present, which was a doorway into other dimensions. The team found a band of negative energy within the tower, and Shirley and Julian, that was the dowser, advised that there were 19 earthbound occupants, which included spirits, souls, thought forms, soul fragments. All these things were present, and Shirley said that they'd missed their connections to the afterlife, and added that the hospitaller had been waiting for the team to arrive, so that she could actually do a blessing ritual to cleanse the tower and thereby release these 19 people or whatever they are. And apparently it was successful, she said, and the temperature then increased. They then went to a site which was just to the south of the Ruskington turn-off, which referred to as Hangman's Hollow, or the Dunsby Hollow. And she got quite emotional. It was a lay-by there, and she was saying that there was a lot of trauma there, and she described it as death, and said that they were 20 yards away from where there had once been a gibbet. She picked up on supernatural smells and explained that various things in the immediate area had served to create confusion in travellers and drivers, particularly late at night, and if they were tired. The team then walked to the nearby fields, where Shirley sensed that a young man who'd been killed when his red Honda motorbike crashed, causing both of his legs to be severed. Sorry, I don't know if it was his legs were severed or whether it was just severe injuries to his leg. And then she gave a blessing and enabled him to go to the afterlife. So when Richard Madeley was with them back in the studio on like the final episode, she said that he asked her about how it had gone. What was that lad on the motorbike? You know, the ghost that Kevin saw, and she said, you know, it was probably another one. But so Richard asked if the phenomena would now cease, given that she had cleansed the area, and Shirley said that they should, and that she was prepared to put her head on the chopping block and say that the area was now clear. And Richard then concluded with, "It's over." But then I did a call for people to write in and tell me if they'd had experiences since then. That went out and was in the Lincolnshire Live website on the 22nd of October in 2019. And unsurprisingly, I got the stories since then, so it wasn't over. And I only got some stories from before then. And I ended up with getting there were 6 other episodes or testimonials that were available on the internet if you cruised around long enough. But I managed to get 8 witness statements from people who'd been in touch and told me their story, specifically to the Ruskington area.
Yeah. I mean, the other aspect of all this is, I know Richard Madeley has said on several occasions that they received numerous witnesses that came forward. I think they were a little bit surprised.
I was in touch via email with Richard, and I'd like to, if he ever gets to listen to this, I'd like to, thank him. He said several dozen. That was the sort of statement that he gave. And that was after they edited out the obvious hoaxes and the people and the time wasters. So they only quoted, a comparatively small percentage. And there was, he and Judy did an article in the Daily Express, I think it was around Halloween time in about 2012, where he looked back to when the Ruskington Horror events happened, and he And he brought in a couple more stories that weren't actually on the programme. So there was obviously quite a few. I mean, when I'd been in touch, I did try and press him about some of the nature of the story, but he couldn't. I mean, we're going back 20-odd years now.
Yes.
You know, so there's a limit on what any of us can remember in detail over that sort of period, yeah.
Absolutely. So when this all started coming together then, Rob, what was the oldest story? Because I know when this originally started on this item on this morning, Rob's experience was quite recent, and I believe the young lady's was also fairly recent, as you say, 1997. So how far back were you able to kind of trace it to people having these kind of weird experiences on this stretch of road?
Well, there were, I was trying to remember exactly which ones they were, but there were certainly three that predated the This Morning programme that I got directly from people. There's one that was back in 1994, which was the uncanny collision that I described. Well, you're probably talking about the 1980s, maybe the late 1980s, something like that.
Yeah.
But there was one in 1988 or 89 here, which was the Christmas cracker. Do you want me to tell you about that one?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. It was, surprise, surprise, it was in December of either 88 or 89 when Isabel... I use pseudonyms all the way through unless people insist on nailing their names to the mast, which is very rare. She'd journeyed from Sleaford to Lincoln with three work colleagues to indulge in some late-night Christmas shopping, and it was a weekday in about 10 o'clock at night when they were travelling back home along the A15. It was cold but dry, and naturally at that time of year it was dark. Everyone was in good spirits and busy chatting, but nobody had been drinking, which is usually only the driver that hasn't been drinking, but
yes. She
says that all four of them hadn't been. And she was sat in the back of the car, and they were probably travelling at about 60 miles an hour when they passed the dip by the Braunsfell turning, which takes you up the incline towards the Ruskington off to the left. And this is what I referred to as the focal site. Of course, it is that stretch of road where most of the action seems to be centred, although it covers a wider area, I hasten to add. But just as a shorthand, I always refer to it as a focal site. Anyway, when they were going up the gradient, suddenly a figure ran out from the field on the left, where there was a ditch and a hedge, and dashed in front of the car. It was caught in the headlights and ran across the road in a diagonal direction down towards Braunsfell, seemingly oblivious to the vehicle. Isabel couldn't make out the features, but knew that it was a male and the size of an adult. His torso was arched forward as he ran. She just remembers him being very dark grey in colour, like a shadow, and can still readily see him in her mind's eye. All four of the people in the car saw the figure and immediately thought that there might have been an accident. They turned the car around to see if anyone needed any help, but they found nothing and no sign of the man. Isabel thought no more about this incident until the Ruskington Horror stories started to get publicised in the 1990s. So again, you've got a typical Phantom Jaywalker type event, but there were four witnesses.
Yeah. And it is often remarkable when we deal with these kind of witnesses, for me, Rob, that a lot of people automatically presume there's been an accident.
I mean, don't forget you're in the middle of nowhere with this place. Your podcast will go all over the world, and so if people aren't familiar, this is real out in the sticks countryside, with fields, flattish fields, and just gentle inclines. To either side, you can see miles and miles, with well, it's agricultural, it's farming in the main, and you've got maybe a few trees gathered by the side of the road and so on and so forth. So you can. One of my issues is certainly at night. There's a question of whether you maintain perspective, in terms of how far you can see things. But that's something that we can come on to later when we talk about what exactly is going on. But this stretch of the road is just a reasonable incline. There's a lay-by on your left, and then you turning to your right. This is heading south, I should add. And then you go up, and then on the brow of the hill, you've got a left turn to Ruskington. Then you go over it, and then it bends to the right, and then round to the left, before you get to another turning, which takes you into Cranwell. So, yeah, it's a sort of countryside that, certainly in this country, if you're on a long drive, you drive through it and you wouldn't think, wow, look, isn't this an interesting place? It's fairly, boring countryside in ways, and I'm not trying to do it disservice there, it's fairly bland, open countryside.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about the area, isn't it? Because large swathes of it, as you say, it's basically farmland, so it's as flat as a pancake as far as the eye can see.
Yeah. So this is people are going along, and they so to come back to the point that you made about that people think there's been an accident. You wonder why a person's out there on foot. Yes. You would think, how did somebody get there in the middle of the night? Well, you're not thinking about hikers. Yes. Although there is currently, with all this COVID stuff going on, people talking about night walking, but I don't think people would be night walking on the A15 at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so you would assume, how did somebody get to that place, wherever it is, and therefore you're assuming that maybe their car's gone into a ditch or whatever. It's just an automatic assumption that you make.
Yeah. I suppose, like you said, that would be the only explanation for somebody wandering about there at night, because it's not a very heavily populated area. You've got the occasional farmhouse dotted about here and there, and that's it, really.
That's it, yeah. This stretch of the road, there is something that I think used to be a school, and it's just been converted to somewhere that into somebody's house on one of the corners. But otherwise, there's nothing there. So when you go over the hill with the Ruskington turn off to your left, then you've got a big open field where Dunsby Village, which was supposed to be a plague village but wasn't from the evidence, which there's no ruins or anything. It's just sort of indentations in the fields, which is where archaeologists might get excited. But from a driver's perspective, there's nothing really to see.
Yeah. So what I found interesting about this as well is there seems to be a variety of experience as well, because as we said, Kevin, what he saw, a lot of other people have kind of described this phantom jaywalker running across them. I know some people have said that they think they've seen a biker, and I think another couple of witnesses have claimed that they got the impression it was a highwayman. So that's the other interesting aspect to this, Rob, is that people seem to report different things in the same area.
Yeah. You have to bear in mind that Lincolnshire is one of those areas which is a bit rich in folklore. Yes. And there were a lot of highwaymen, because you had the main old roads, which the A15 and that were. And so apparently Dick Turpin's been on every road, I think, in the country.
Yeah, where hasn't he been?
He's a bit of a lad, Black Bess has probably died. But if you go further north from where we're talking about, there is a thing called the Dunstan pillar, which was, according to what I can make out, the only inland lighthouse in the country. And the reason for this was that it was such like a bad area that this was to shed light so that you would drive these ne'er-do-well highwaymen, in the sense, away from the area and add some protection to stagecoaches. Because don't forget, the roads in those days, they're not like they are now, tarmacked. They were rough and ready and made in mud, and if it had been raining, a stagecoach full of people going up an incline, it would be very slow.
Yeah.
And they would be very isolated, and it would be comparatively easy pickings for highwaymen. And there wasn't the police, as there were like these days, where you could set a trap or something. So there were a fair number of places where highwaymen could intercept a stagecoach or the travellers. So there's talks about gibbets, as was what they used to do with highwaymen. They'd hang them and they'd suspend them in the gibbet near to wherever they'd committed their crime, to encourage passers-by not to become highwaymen or something like that. So, yeah, but of course when you've got something called hollow, there's the alliteration of it. Oh, it's highways hollow, or highwaymen's hollow, or something along those lines. And people, do get enthused about trying to imagine, I think, highwaymen or whatever. It's part of the, I don't know, like the subconscious psyche, I think, of everybody in this country. If you're out in the wilds, you could always imagine that there'd be a highwayman or something like that. But of course, the other type of person that is apparently the cause of all this are witches.
Yes.
And there's a lot of famous folklore around that neck of the woods to do with witches. And the one that I quote in Fortean Times, partly because it was actually quoted on the programme. There's a thing called Old Meg the Witch was supposed to haunt the place, and she ended up being hunted down by a knight who was riding the horse, which was supposed to be blind in some versions, called Bayard. And when he catches the witch and they fight, she leaps on the back of the horse and digs her claws, or presumably fingernails, into the horse's side, and he leaps something like 60 feet before crashing to the ground, dislodging the witch. And then the knight obviously then gets his sword out and kills her. And there is actually a place called Bayard's Leap. Now, this is to do with folklore. I mean, they've actually got a framed on the ground, area with 4 horseshoes, just so that you can imagine that there was a horse there on it. And good luck to it. There's a hamlet called Ancaster Heath, but it all happened nearby. But that's actually about 5 miles away from where Kevin Whelan had his experience. But some people have tried to argue that whatever this creature in black, often these creatures or phenomena, whatever you want to call them, are in black. And there's supposed to be like a witch warning, or a warning of a witch, all that. And some of the stories do sound as though they're warning, but who's to say? Because what we're talking about in the main are incidents that have taken seconds, 10 seconds, no more than 30 seconds in the main. And these phenomena very, very, very rarely actually say anything. There are examples, and I have collected in all my Lincolnshire researches. I've actually come across a talking ghost, which is good fun. But I'm not going to tell you all about that tonight, because all these things are going to be in various issues of Fortean Times, which I want people to actually buy. But there's a few teasers which I'll give you later. But one of them, as I say, is a talking ghost riding a bike. So where were we? We were talking about the witches.
Yes.
So again, witchcraft has a long history in the county, and so it's not necessarily that surprising that people will try and find some link with it. because at the end of the day, the phenomena, you're not too sure what they are. And so people naturally try and rationalise or explain what these things may or may not be. And historical characters like witches or highwaymen obviously are in the psyche around that neck of the woods.
Yeah. It is interesting that we have such a variety of things, and like you say, it is an area steeped in folklore and legend going back centuries, Rob.
Yeah.
And yet, most of the people who are reporting things, it doesn't seem to tie into that. And it seems that sometimes when we have experiences like this from a variety of people try to tie it to the folklore and the myths of the area, like you were saying about the connection with this Knights Templar crypt, which is, even for me, is a bit of a stretch, going the fact that it's not really that close to this kind of area, and nobody, if people were reporting seeing a knight wandering about, then, fair enough, we might have some kind of wandering spirit that way, but there seems to be a lot of different things, and I know some people presumed it was a policeman. Some people thought it was somebody from the RAF base nearby. So it is unusual that lots of different people have had very different experiences, or they certainly take that response
Well, they might
away.
not have had very different experiences, but they might have interpreted them differently.
Yes.
Or rationalised them differently. I mean, if you go back to the Temple Brewer Preceptory, I was contacted by Gary Ross, who's of the Links Paranormal Research Group, and he was great. He provided me with a lot of local information and was very, very helpful in providing me with photos and whatever. But he actually said, they've looked at there, and there's never been anything particularly ghostly as far as they've ever been able to track down. But all of a sudden, the ITV this morning crew go in, and suddenly there's 19 of them hanging around. So you have to keep an open mind.
Yes.
I think but also, as you quite rightly say, in World War II, Lincolnshire was almost one very, very large RAF base.
Yes.
There were that many airfields across there. And it's not necessarily unsurprising that people will bring in the RAF at one point. In fact, when Shirley was talking about the preceptory, two of the characters seem to be an RAF couple. So I don't know. I'm a 49. I just like to keep an open mind and enjoy the ride, as it were, because I don't know where it's going to take me. And the one, I was interviewed for BBC Radio Lincolnshire, but the one case that was one that Gary actually gave me. So technically, it's a second-hand story because I only go for first-hand or second-hand stories, because otherwise you start to get into friend of a friend, urban legend territory. And Gary sent me this one story, which is a brief one that I'll just read out because I thought it was quite a significant episode. And that was back in the spring of 2003. Note, it's after the ITV programme. There's a female taxi driver who, in her early 40s, who was driving north up the A15 towards Lincoln around 1 o'clock in the morning, having dropped someone off in Sleaford. She'd just passed the Ruskington turn-off and was therefore at the focal site on going down when a figure ran in front of her car. Phantom jaywalker stuff again. It looked straight at her with an open mouth as if screaming, and then vanished under the vehicle, although she felt no impact. She stopped and looked around but saw nothing unusual. She was naturally terrified and telephoned the office, who telephoned the police. The police arrived but found nothing, and there was no impact marks anywhere on the car. The woman was so traumatised that the police drove her home, one of the officers driving the taxi, and apparently she gave up the job the next day. And Gary was told the story by the woman who was actually working in the control room for the taxi firm, which he named, at the time of the incident. The witness claimed that she hadn't been speeding. I know Gary would have tried to have got to have interviewed her, but unfortunately he wasn't able. But the police did confirm that they've received several similar reports over the years.
One of the other aspects that's quite interesting about this is that obviously, I've recently had Ruth Roper Wilde on a couple of times, Rob, and in Ruth's roadmap of the British Isles, there is actually a repeat incident, I believe, in the same area which is very peculiar, that someone suffers two separate incidents over quite a distance of time that could be tied into this as well.
I mean, that it wasn't exactly in the same location. Ruth Roper Wilde's story, I mean, that's going back to 1999 originally, where a guy was driving his Mini along the roads around Evedon, which is about 5 miles from the focal site, with his parents following in their car. He thought it was very uneventful, the journey, but when they got home, then his mum rushed over to him to say that they'd seen him actually drive through somebody who was walking along the road, and thought that they'd must have killed them or hit them, because they thought he was a real person, but then realised that it couldn't have been. And then a few days later, when he went to visit a friend and drove down the same road, someone jumped out in the front of the car, making him brake and swerved and ended up in a ditch. But there wasn't anybody there. And then the following Christmas Eve. So this is sort of like a series, spaced apart, but not too far apart. He allowed his friend to drive the Mini, and they found themselves on the same stretch of road, and this time the Mini cut out, and so they had to pull over. They tried to get the engine started again, but then they thought they could smell burning, and naturally, the discretion being the better part of valour, they leapt out the car and scrambled onto the road just as the car burst into flames. The fire service found the rational explanation for the fire, but not for the breakdown itself. So although those incidents, which were very strange, took place a few miles from the focal site, they are still part in the area, broader area, and they do suggest a recurrent phenomenon.
These incidents all seem to be, this seems to be expanding this area, because like you say, these mini incidents are about 5 miles away from this hub where the majority of experiences have happened. So why do you think this area seems so prone? Because as we've touched on, there's not much there.
There isn't, but one of the things that I speculate about is the fact that the nature of the landscape. And if you, this is something I've said on many occasions, if you're driving, you, me, lots and lots of people, if you're a driver and you're driving through on a long journey, maybe a journey that you've done umpteen times before, and it's dark. Well, how many times have you been driving along and you thought, I don't remember the last 10 minutes or 15 minutes? Yeah. Because you go into sort of like autopilot mode, and you don't necessarily, unless something happens, you don't necessarily take any notice, and maybe question, do you go into an altered state of consciousness, as it were. Now, I like to keep an open mind about that, but if you take that stretch of the A15 around Ruskington, then it is something of a motoring black spot, and it's worth noting that many of the witnesses admitted to travelling a tad above the speed limit. Yes. I mean, we've all been the same. I mean, when I'm driving home from a match down in Wolverhampton, I possibly go slightly faster than I would. Yes. Certainly in the day, because when you're driving at night, you allow for the fact that there isn't any oncoming traffic because there's no headlights coming towards you. You know what I'm saying? Now, it is reasonable to assume that driving fast down a long, monotonous, undulating road with flat fields either side, with maybe occasional trees and hedges breaking the headlight beams at night, it can be quite mesmeric and disorientating, particularly if the driver is tired. Now, I haven't driven out there, certainly not in COVID-19 times, but it's amazing what you can do by going on like the Google road maps and things like that.
Yeah.
So effectively you can drive up and down this road to your heart's content in some sort of alter ego sort of situation. And to the north and south of the focal point, a little distance before in both directions, there are sharp bends.
Yeah.
And they have the reduce speed now markings. You know, the big arrows, black and white arrows.
Yeah.
Now, those are there meant to make drivers become alert. Now, because of that, maybe some of them become over alert, if there is such a description, making them take in more information from the environment than they usually do. Now, I've talked about, I think I've probably talked about it when I was in last year's podcast, about there are physiological and psychological reasons why, if you do become over alert for whatever reason, somehow you can overload your brain.
Yes.
And it can cause hallucinations or what have you. And so it might be that there's some consequential images created by pareidolia from the passing landscape. You know, like the headlights flash across a tree that looks like, you know, the shape of a man or something like that. It could be. In fact, Gary did actually, Gary Ross did talk about one case where some people thought that they'd seen somebody peeking out from behind bushes, and he went the next day and had a look, and there was like an area of bark off a tree, which, if you looked at it as you were driving past, could look like what they talked about. It was at the same spot. So sometimes, you know, your mind can interpret images, and the other thing is that after all, drivers do keep the possibility of sometimes of something appearing in the road ahead of them at the back of your mind. And if you drive down the streets, you're always worried that a kid might run out from between cars or something like that. So it's always there at the back of your mind.
Yeah.
And also that you can have hypnagogic hallucinations. It could be a factor that, you know, you can't exclude those either. Although several of the sightings that I've talked about in my articles do involve multiple witnesses, which would suggest that that isn't the reason in those specific episodes. So what my original question, which I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, was, is it something in the landscape? And what you've got is a low-lying panorama and frequent mists that somehow induce psychological reactions. And I think the answer must be yes. What you've got, Shirley Wallace, she suggested on the This Morning program that perhaps the traveller's state of mind plays a crucial role. And if so, does it create hallucinations, or does it perceive external paranormal phenomena that are already present? Which of the two is at play in the Ruskington Horror is impossible to determine. But it's one of the things that maybe it is that people go into an altered state and then do perceive things that may or may not be there, as the case may be. But you'll never prove beyond any reasonable doubt, simply because, as I said earlier, these events take 10, 30 seconds and then never happen again. If you look at the numbers that I've got, and even allowing for the several dozen that Richard Madeley talked about, You're going over 30-odd years.
Yeah.
So he's talking about 1 or 2 a year.
Yeah.
Well, that's not a lot.
Yeah.
So if you decided to be a real ghost hunter and get your thermos flask full of coffee and sandwiches and go and park yourself in the lay-by at the bottom of the incline that we talked about, the only thing that's likely to appear at your windscreen will be a policeman saying, "Why aren't you sticking with the COVID rules?"
Yes, yes, very true, very true. And I think the other aspect of this is that these seem to happen at any point of the year as well, Rob. There's not a specific time of year that these occurrences happen.
Correct. I mean, some of them are in the summer, some of them in the winter. I mean, all through the year at different times, yeah.
Yeah, and to be fair, having heard about Joe's experience in that lay-by when he stopped to have a smoke, I don't think I'll be pulling up there at night, my friend.
No, that's true. That is true.
Because that's quite an interesting aspect to all this, because that's the one out of all the reports that you've collected, for me, it would seem, Rob, that there seems to have been some kind of physical response other than shock or fear. What happened to Joe?
Well, Joe and his partner had been travelling from Boston late at night, and they decided to pull in at the lay-by near Ruskington for a smoke. This is from the internet, so he didn't actually say what they were smoking. I innocently infer that it was tobacco.
Yes.
So anyway, there was little traffic and it was fairly quiet, and they were just sat there in silence while each of them experienced quite a strange sensation, as if they were struggling to breathe and their chests were feeling tight. Clearly this is something distinct and separate from smoking a cigarette. And they said it was a bit like being strangled by an invisible hand. It eventually wore off, and they both looked at each other in amazement, and then drove away as quickly as they could. And this is where they go. Subsequently, they did some research and found that in the olden days, they used to hang slaves all around the area, and that's why it's called the Ruskington Horrors, for which the last sentence must post-date 1998, because Richard made it up in 1998.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's always a danger of an element of people. I mean, people go onto the internet and they'll see that, and they won't necessarily, make the connection, and will believe it. Yeah. I mean, they might have hung highwaymen, but. That's the only reference I've ever seen to hanging slaves. And why would you hang slaves?
Yeah.
They're no good to you if they're dead.
No, precisely. and that does remind me of Stocksbridge Bypass here, Rob, in Sheffield, where the story now bears very little resemblance to what actually happened. So are you still getting people coming forward in regards to this area then, Rob?
Yes, I am. I mean, I'm getting people coming forward in all lots of ways, including, can I say, in the past week or so, one of your podcast fans from Virginia in the US of A came on with a story about some maybe teleporting monks. I'm not sure how it would be described, but that's another story to be dealt with. I haven't finished it totally, but I'm in email communication, and it's an interesting little story. But am I getting stories? I've actually got enough stories from Lincolnshire to come up with about 7 or 8 articles, which includes one that I had very recently, which I called it the Ruskington Goblin.
Ooh, tell us more.
Well, it's a very short piece, and it was only on reading my articles, because the person concerned is a subscriber to Fortune Times, that the person, the witness, said, hang on, what happened to me was right in the middle of that area where all these strange things were going on, according to Rob's articles. Simply, he was driving along the road at night, probably I think it was about 10 o'clock, I might be corrected, and in a flow of traffic, doing about 55 miles an hour, when, as he drives along the swamp patch, he sees, running along the road to the left by the curb, well, not a curb, but, by the edge of the road, a little man no more than a foot high. but he goes past him pretty quickly, but he was fairly certain that it was a little man that he called a goblin. And couldn't believe it. Looked at the dash cam. It's not quite the same. I mean, but dash cams distort whatever they, But and he wouldn't have thought. He thought, well, maybe it was a rabbit or a hare, but he's used to what they look like, and he couldn't explain it. And he definitely had this image of somebody or something running along, like with its feet picking up and its arms swinging. And it was only when he read my article and he thought, well, actually, maybe this is something that's somehow linked to all the other strange things that are going on in that area. So, yeah, there's not a lot more than that you can say about it. But what he's hoping is that if... and I might do just a short piece in Fortune Times about that, then maybe there are people out there who are going, well, actually, there's a look. I spotted that goblin, as the case may be. Because sometimes it's only when you actually publicise something that people respond and go, that happened to me as well. And therefore they don't feel alone or feel so isolated, and so they can speak. They can feel free to come forward about it. Because otherwise, people expect to be made fun of or to be... And so I think a lot of strange, weird stuff goes on across the planet, but people only share it with their immediate family or close friends. So I think the family lore, LORE, is very important if you're researching, ghosts or strange phenomena, because I think there's a lot there that people know about and people have talked about, but it's never been publicised. So there's maybe a rich ocean to be trawling of it, which is probably how I get most of the stories. So, I mean, as I say, there's a lot of articles. I mean, I did... another call for witnesses following a lady getting in touch with me in response to the Ruskington Horror to say, well, this happened to me and it's nowhere near Ruskington, so do I count? So I said, oh, God. So what's your story? And it's kind of, wow. Yeah. So I did a call, and I called it the Scunthorpe Road Spectre in Scunthorpe.
Yes.
Can't say that quickly enough. And, I mean, that went out on the 15th of December in the local press. And, wow, I mean, you're talking about a 12-foot monk. Come on, it's great. Strolling along in the rain, being witnessed by two people for about 10 minutes. Very strange.
Yeah.
So, So I did an outline of that in the local press, and I got lots of phantom jaywalkers and so on and so forth coming along. I've split all of them into reasonably homogeneous articles. So I've got weird wheels from the Wolds, which is the one which includes a talking ghost on a bicycle. And scary stories from Scunthorpe, which, as I say, has got this Scunthorpe Road Spectre on there, as well as some, phantom jaywalkers. Yeah. There's one where I call it Imperious Lincolnshire, with brackets about the ER, so it's Impious Lincolnshire, because everybody's very familiar with the Lincoln Imp.
Yes.
Which is in the cathedral, and it's the nickname of the local football team.
Indeed.
I will tell you now that there's a couple of stories, there are one or two others as well in the whole lot, but there's a couple in there where, if you're familiar with the film Spinal Tap,
yes,
there's a couple of testimonies that go up to 11. I mean, I'm kind of, wow. I mean, they knock the caps off the teeth, even of the Ruskington Horror, as far as I'm concerned. They include, I'll say no more than a little girl in a nightdress standing in front of the old mental health hospital at St John's Hospital in Bracebridge Heath. Mm-hmm. And also strange things on Tom Otter's Lane. Mm-hmm. Do you know who Tom Otter is?
I don't know. Tell me more.
No, I'm not going to tell you too much. He was a murderer. Let's just say that.
Right.
You'll be straight on to Google it. I know your sort. That was a classic case of what I call chasing the dragon in terms of Fortean research, where not so much a hunch, but you think, why is it called that? Why is that lane called that name? And then you chase it, and then you follow it, and then you piece things together, and you think, wow, yeah, that's weird. Anyway, I also got one which I called Not the Face, because it's about phantoms that don't have faces. And supposedly one of them, or some of them, haunt Bolton Park in Lincolnshire. And you know Barry Baldwin, who writes the classical corner for Fortune Times. I mean, he's based out in Calgary in Canada. He's a Lincolnshire lad, and I think it typifies the comment that you can take the lad out of Lincolnshire, but you'll never take Lincolnshire out of the lad. And he writes occasionally for the Lincolnshire Poacher and that sort of thing. But I was in correspondence with him about Bolton Park, and he said, I used to go courting in Bolton Park. Yeah, I said, did you see any phantom with no face? He said he was too busy doing other things to spot any fiendish phantom without a face. And then the last one that I've done, I called it A Warning to the Fortean, which is a couple of cases where of linking ghosts with folklore, where I think it's very easy to. There are lots and lots of ghost stories around everywhere. Yeah. But maybe there aren't ghosts. Maybe it's to do with folklore. I won't say any more about it, but it's one of the things that I think is important when you are researching these sorts of things that I do research, and to make sure that you don't get not become too gullible, but you can become too trusting of what people say in good faith. Yes. You know, I will say this about all the people that have corresponded. As far as I can see, they're all very sincere. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a mundane explanation for their experience. And I think that when you do this sort of research, then you have to fairly and gently explore what's been going on and seek out rational explanations where you can. But often, going back to the Ruskington Horror, when you get lots of similar things happening, even if it's to one person in a number of cases, it's like witnesses to a crime. You know, it is building up evidence, even if in each individual case you might be able to kind of say, oh no, they were hallucinating, or whatever. Well, for lots of people to have similar hallucinations in the same place. Yes. Then what's going on?
Have you been surprised that this area seems so ripe for people to have these experiences, Rob? Because frankly, I think that I do think, as I said before, I think the landscape's got something to do with it, and the way that in the way that also you're more inclined to get mists and mellow fruitfulness and whatever in these sort of flat areas. Yeah. So it doesn't surprise me too much. In fact, I'd be very interested if there are any of your listeners who might be in places like, I don't know, the Somerset Levels or other places where there's rich folklore. Yeah. Or lots and lots of people having experiences. I've been in touch recently, a researcher with similar interests called David Taylor, who is in the Stourbridge area, which is where both my grandfathers come from. I'm a black country boy personally, and there's a road that's not far from Cradley, from Halesowen,
where quite a few things have been witnessed on the roads, like little girls, or ghosts of little girls, ghosts of people from a different era, or what have you. And he's got a number of these. They've not been published as such, I think. He's collected them, but I was in touch with him, and we're thinking about putting something in the local press to see if there's been anything recent in the last 10, 12 years. A bit like how I did the Ruskington Horror approach, and just see what we get. Sometimes you strike gold, sometimes you don't. Yeah. But if you don't try, then you don't get.
Absolutely. So, in regards to this particular area in Lincolnshire, Rob,
yes.
As you touched on there...
Although bear in mind that I've got sufficient cases to say it's the whole of Lincolnshire.
As you were saying about the topography of the area and the landscape, do you think it's... could you compare it to, say, I know you just mentioned there the Somerset Levels, or perhaps the Fens in East Anglia. Is there a same rich tradition in those particular areas of a similar type of phenomenon?
Simple answer is I don't know specifics, but I came across the Ruskington Horror when I was looking for other places that might have a similar landscape and experiences to Halsall Moss, which is a big flat area, a farmland. So there are a lot of parallels in it. So I say it's early days, in the sense that you start off with one area and then you see parallels in another area. There may well be another area where this is the case, in which case, I'm very happy to dig and delve deep if I can get a lead in there. But sometimes with a lot of this reporting research, it's just happenstance. You get a possible lead. Like I've got quite a few stories now about Shugborough Hall in Staffordshire, which came about simply because a good fortune friend who shares the same birthday as me, I mean literally we were born on the same day, he'd been talking to Lord Lichfield, who told him about some ghostly goings on that he had experienced. And so because I knew somebody in that area, and if you remember, I did an article, Brides, Bridges and Spacemen.
Yes.
Yeah. And the one where there's a purported photo of the ghost of Emily, or
yes.
Whatever. So the lady who gave me the information around that, I mean, that's next door to Shugborough. With her help, hi Eve, if you're listening. And then I've almost topped and tailed the stories that she's been able to garner from local groups. So altogether, there'd be half a dozen testimonies. And you start to think, there's something strange about Great Haywood. Almost like time slip type things. So yeah, that's one I have yet to write up, but that was all down to my mate David getting in touch and just saying, I had a chat with Lord Lichfield a few years ago and he told me this. So you chase a dragon sometimes. Sometimes you get somewhere, sometimes you don't. It's not something that you can easily plan.
Yeah.
And I think you've just got to be opportunistic. Is the reality of it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other aspects, I know when you were on last time, Rob, we touched on phantom hitchhikers, and I remember recently reading an article about someone lamenting the loss of these stories as some kind of urban myth or modern folklore in regards to that. And obviously, the one of my favourite ghost encounters is obviously Ray Benton, who was the guy that picked one up and offered him a cigarette before he disappeared. So, do you think that we've moved on from these, or do you still occasionally come across new hitchhiker stories or new hitchhiker legends?
Well, I was in correspondence probably about a couple of years ago with Professor Jan Brunvand, who
Yes.
did The Vanishing Hitchhiker.
Mm-hmm.
I've shared a number of my articles with him because he believed them all to be urban legends, as I'm saying. No, they're not.
Yes, yes.
Some of these things are really happened. Oh gosh, and he's a great guy. He's retired now. I mean, he's I think he's well into his late 70s, early 80s. I'm not sure which. Anyway, at one point, I don't know how it came up, but he indicated, and he wrote a paper. I'll email it to you. I've got a copy of it. It's not in a shape or form that was. I think it was published, but not necessarily in a major journal. And I've got. He kindly sent me as it were, an unfinished type version of it.
Yeah.
What he suggested was that urban legends per se, as they were when he was doing the Vanishing Hitchhiker stuff, really has declined, if not disappeared. The reason, he says, for this is that everything's gone online. It's the internet. It's not urban legends. It's now cyber legends. In that people don't now get the story about, it's you're in the pub in the 60s or the 70s. Yeah. Well, I was anyway. And you end up chatting to friends. You weren't. If it was a pub quiz, you tried to rack your brains. You didn't go and slide your mobile phone out and Google what the answer was. There was no such thing. I mean, I did computing as a student, 69 to 72, and the computer was as big as a house, and you had, you had cards and paper tape, which you punched the code and data into.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, when you think about even in the last few years, the power of mobile phones, it's frightening compared to how crude and that we were dealing with back in those days. And of course, in those days, you got most of your information either from newspapers or from talking to people. Now, most people get their information from the television and the internet. Yeah. And you've got lots of websites and people are setting things up, for various reasons. And you've got things like podcasts, dare I say, which is bunging out information about these things, left, right and centre. And there's no element of overload. But you were told something in the past, and therefore you thought, wow, that was a great story I heard from Trev. And so you then go to another pub on another day with different friends, and you'd say, I heard this great story from Trev, and and this is what happened. But of course, with the best will in the world, you won't tell it exactly the same.
Yeah.
And those friends will go, wow, that was a fantastic story that Rob told. And they'll tell it. And so the stories evolve. Whereas now, what you're more likely to get is a link. I saw this on the internet, on this website or whatever. I'll forward you the link. And you don't know what some of the people might have put. I mean, I've seen one or two things on the internet where people, I think there's some to do with like the Ruskington Horror, which I had to watch because I was researching it. But it's along the lines of, wow, look at that. Two young blokes driving along in a car around the lanes of Lincolnshire, and they just happen to bump into a ghost. And I'm staring at it and thinking, I can't see the damn thing. I mean, so it's like a lot of life. It all evolves. But I think that now so much of it is on the internet. And let's face it, the software that is available these days, some people can manufacture images and things that seem real, but they're not necessarily. Whereas that wasn't the case, all those years ago when I was young. So I think that this sort of research has evolved, and I like to be able to, grab hold of a magazine like Fortune Times and hold it and read it.
Yeah.
Whereas it's not. I don't think it's the same to have something like a tablet or a mobile phone and be peering on trying to read the small print and flicking it. I mean, my grandchildren will no doubt, they'll go up to a book and with their fingers they'll try and expand the print. And I'm thinking, no, it doesn't work like that, love.
Yeah, very true, very true. And it is always interesting as well, because you might not find the correct resource, or you might find a version that somebody wants to promote. There are several things that seem to have varying versions depending on which websites you go to, and you end up having to sort of keep checking everything against each other, because there are so many variations of certain stories that even I know, Rob, that the online version bears no resemblance to what really happened.
Well, I'm not going to be critical about the people that publish my, calls on the internet for the Ruskington Horror or the Scotter Road Spectre. But what I sent them, and what appeared in print, well, they weren't exactly the same. And I find myself sometimes I've been described as a paranormal expert. No, I'm not. What am I? I collect people's stories. Yeah. And I try and make them, as rounded, as comprehensive, and as accurate as possible, so that the person can say, yeah, that's how it happened. And then I, group them into articles that, around a given theme or what have you, and try and be objective about it. But expert? Nobody's an expert about the paranormal. Yeah. If they were, then we'd all know the answer. And we don't, which is what keeps us going.
Very true, very true. Yeah. So what's next for you, Rob? What have you got any kind of cases coming up?
A large glass of wine after I finish talking to you.
In regards to your research rather than your refreshment.
Well, I will be sending the mock-up of the Ruskington Goblin to David Sutton at 14 Times the end of this week. I've had an article published about how Fairies Field in Wolverhampton, which I knew as a child, was called Fairies Field, and that's in the Fairy Investigation Society's newsletter, and may eventually surface in 14 Times as well. Unfortunately, there were no real fairies there. That's a spoiler for you. But it was something that, as a kid, it was always called Fairies Field, and I always wondered. So I decided to try and look into it, and it's very interesting actually. I reckon I've got the answer, but so that was one of the things that I've been looking into. I've mentioned to you about Shugborough Hall. I have an envelope in the next room from a lady who was very helpful to me on the Fairies Field research, and she's telling me about black-eyed children in Cannock Chase. I think. Strange place, Cannock Chase, which amazingly is very close to Shugborough Hall. So, the Staffordshire lad myself, Yeah. I think those are the ones that I've got on the go at the moment. I've got at the back of my mind that I'm missing one, but I can't think what it is. The Haunted Road or what have you, down in Hales Owen. Yes. I'm looking to do something with David Taylor on that. So, yeah, it keeps me busy. Absolutely. And my mind active. It's about stopping me going senile. So,
well, these things that do keep us moving and keep us motivated, Rob. Absolutely. So it's I think that's half the fun.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's so many amazing stories out there, and sometimes you come across something you think, that can't be real, but then there are people that are adamant that it is. Yeah. Alternatively, there's a couple that I sent in to David Sutton, which have got nothing to do with that, but they're like about football curses and things like that. Yes. All always good fun. Certainly when you're talking about Argentina.
Yes.
So, did you know that there is actually a church which worships Maradona?
I do indeed, yes.
Yeah. You're not the local vicar, are you?
No, but yeah, there are some real ones. I mean, obviously you've got the famous Babe Ruth case, which is probably one of the most famous sporting curses.
Oh, I've forgotten that one.
Well, that's the one where he was sold by the Red Sox, traded him, and he claimed to say to them that you'll never win the World Series again. And obviously they went something like 86 years. Obviously, strangely enough, I was in the States when they finally won the World Series again.
Oh, right. No, there's the one that which is about Racing, which is the dead cat.
Yes.
You know about that one, the dead cat, one in the Racing Club in Buenos Aires, which was interesting. And then the other one is Benfica. When their manager, who just won them the European Cup 2 years running, or whatever it was, and said, you'll never win another, they sacked him.
Yes.
No, hang on. Can't remember if they sacked him or they refused to give him a pay rise, so he walked out. One or the other. And so he said, you'll never win a major European trophy again, sort of like thing. We're in the final this year, mate.
Yeah.
So, and they've been in about 8 finals since.
Yes.
They've not won one of them.
Yeah.
And apparently the one year when I forget who they were up against, the final was in Germany or Hungary or somewhere like that, where the manager, the ex-manager involved is buried, and Eusebio went and went to his grave and basically said, please break up the curse.
Beg for his forgiveness from beyond the grave.
Lost, of course.
Yes.
So I do veer from the sublime to the ridiculous when it comes to my Fortean research. So you gotta have some fun with it. Yeah.
Absolutely. So where can everybody get hold of you, Rob, if they've got an experience they want to share or can add to any of your research?
Just send blank checks to this address. Anybody out there has had any strange experiences that they're prepared to tell me about, then if they send me an email on rob.gandy, Gandy, at ntlworld, all one word, .com.
Lovely. Well, I'll make sure I put that in the show notes for anybody that wants to drop you a line, and obviously they can keep up to date with your most recent articles in the current Fortean Times. The last few issues have had some fabulous work from you, Rob, and I would imagine we're going to see some more this year.
Well, it's all down to whether David Sutton can slip them in. Hopefully he will. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you as always for coming back, Rob. It's a pleasure as always. You take care, my friend.
And you. Take care now. Bye-bye.